felt that I had gone too far, and others who had felt that I had not gone far enough. And they were concerned that I would buckle under the pressure and take it all back. I walked slowly, but I never walked backward. I may not be a bold man, but I have a knack of sticking to my promises. General McClernand from the Union side wrote a letter to me saying that the Emancipation Proclamation would be bad for troop morale. Part of my reply is as follows. I have issued the Emancipation Proclamation and I cannot retract it. After the commencement of hostilities, I struggled nearly a year and a half to get along without touching the institution. And when finally I conditionally determined to touch it, I gave 100 days fair notice of my purpose to all states and people, within which time they could have turned it wholly aside by simply again becoming good citizens of the United States. They chose to disregard it, and I made the peremptory proclamation of what appeared to me to be a military necessity. And being made, it must stand. General Grant wrote to me and said that he was in favor of the Negro enlisting into the Army. And I replied back saying, it works doubly. It strengthens us and weakens the enemy. Sojourner Truth came to me and said that I was the first president who had ever done anything for her people. I replied, and the only one who ever had the opportunity. Had our Southern friends behaved themselves, I could have done nothing whatever. In that summer, I met for the first time Frederick Douglass. He came into my office and we talked for a while. Douglass made an impression on me. Later, I would say that he was one of the most meritorious men in the country. In early November, I received an invitation to make a few appropriate remarks at the dedication of a new national cemetery in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the site of a great 3-day battle earlier in July. I accepted it. It would be the first formal address I would have made since the inauguration. In thinking of what to say, I thought of the Declaration of Independence because it had been signed 87 years before, or, to use phraseology from the Bible, 77 years ago. I also thought of the slaves because contained in the Declaration of Independence was the proposition, all men are created equal. In Euclidean geometry, a proposition is something that is in need of proof. And the outcome of this war will be the proof if all men are created equal or not. I also wanted to say that it was those who had fought on the battlefield who had dedicated the occasion, and that it was for us, the living, to rededicate ourselves here to the noble cause, which is why I use the word here 7 times. Up to this point, most of my writing had been to merely describe and explain what is. This address will be the closest I would come to telling the people what they could do. I said there was unfinished work as an invitation that we should finish the work. If we are to rededicate ourselves, then 4 things must occur, and they are all found in the last sentence. And each one began with the phrase that from these honored dead, If we can increase our devotion to that cause, it will more closely match the devotion shown by those who had fought on the battlefield. That we here highly resolve, we could vow to continue on. That this nation shall have a new birth of freedom. And this is where freeing the slaves comes about. We could give a new and larger meaning to the words liberty for all, just as white people enjoyed liberty, so should black people enjoy liberty. And when I made that address, I did something that I rarely did. I added words to it, under God. And in subsequent requests for copies of my address, I kept those words in there. You see, God looks down on all of us, both with approval at what we do and as a witness. And the last, that government of the people. And when I spoke those words, I emphasized the word people, because it is the people who make up this government. We must show the world that democracy is not an absurdity, that people can run the government. We don't have to leave it to some tyrants or some supposed divine right of kings. We are the last best hope of earth, and it should not end. The day after the occasion, I received a note from the main speaker of the day, Edward Everett, who spoke from memory for 2 hours. He said, "I should be glad if I could flatter myself that I came as near to the central idea of the occasion in 2 hours as you did in 2 minutes." "Fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation, or any nation so conceived and so dedicated, can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place to those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fit and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it, far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note, nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth.
Well, as I told you before, Mr. Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And one thing it did, it opened the Union forces to African Americans. Now my brave men could fight for their own freedom. But you see, that led to a most interesting meeting at the White House. There I was, in an audience filled with men, and I was the only dark spot there. We all filled out papers and sent them forward, hoping to be seen by the president. Many times people go there and fill papers out and send them forward, and they never get to see the president. Well, I filled my card out, sent it forward, as the other gentleman did. And soon a man appeared at the top of the stairs. And he said, "The president wishes to see Frederick Douglass. First of all, you should have heard the names that I was called." I stood up and headed for the stairs. "Out of my way. I'm Frederick Douglass. The president wants to see me." As I approached the stairs and began to ascend, I thought about my grandmother Betsy. I thought about my mother Harriet. And as I ascended to the top of the stairs, I stood in the doorway and I looked in. And there sat Abraham Lincoln. He had one foot in that part of the room. He had one foot in that part of the room, and the other foot in this part of the room. And I approached him, and he began to rise. And rise. And rise. I reached out my hand.
Mr.
To
Douglas.
I was going to introduce myself, but he already. Yes.
Mr. Douglas, I know you.
Yes.
Mr. Seward has told me about you. I know all about you. Please, what can I do for you?
You say you know me. If you know me, you know I'm a free man. Mr. President, I am not here for myself. I'm here for those I represent. May I have a seat?
Please, let us talk.
Mr. President, thousands of my brave black men are fighting in your army, and dying, many of them, in your army. When I recruited them, I was told to tell them, to promise them, that if they enlisted, they would receive equal pay and equal accommodations. And Mr. President, none of that is happening. And today, many of my men are reluctant to enlist. And if you don't do something about that, Mr. President, you will be held equally responsible as Jefferson Davis.
My hesitancy is because of issuing that proclamation is because the country was not ready for it. The Negro is a hated man, a despised man throughout the country. And if I came out too soon with such a proclamation, all the hatred poured on the head of the Negro race would be visited on this administration. They would say, we thought it would come to this. White men are to be killed for the Negro. Preparatory work had to be done, and it has been done. And once I took the position, no man can say that I have contradicted it or retreated from it.
The meeting went as well as expected. And I left there thinking that Abraham Lincoln was, in fact, an honest man. He made me feel like a man. And as I left his presence, he stood up and shook my hand and promised me that things would change, and I believed him.
Abraham Lincoln had convinced many in the North that the emancipation of African Americans, and including them in the Union forces, would shorten the war. And they took him at his word. While most of the North did not suddenly become abolitionist and embrace the idea of black equality, they did, however, become ready emancipationists. They thought to themselves, well, if freeing the black man can free my husband, my son, my brother, my uncle, sooner from this awful war, that's fine with me, and it'll punish the South as well. That works just fine. The difficulty, however, is that as 1863, after the bloodletting of Gettysburg, stretched into 1864, the war didn't seem any closer to finishing. But Lincoln thought that perhaps he had finally found a general in Ulysses S. Grant that might do what all of the many generals of the Army of the Potomac who he had run through, who Lincoln had run through, couldn't seem to do. And that was finally issue a death blow to the Army of Northern Virginia, to put down Robert E. Lee's famous army. And so he put Grant in charge. And many in the North hoped that this would finally be the end. But as Grant began his spring campaign in 1864, rather than the war ending, it simply got bloodier. Grant became known as a butcher. More Union soldiers died in the first few months of this spring campaign in combat than in the entirety of combat in the war previously. And as Lee dodged his way back and forth in a zigzag down into Virginia and finally into the trenches of Petersburg, Grant's army laid siege. But he just simply couldn't seem to get at Lee's army and finish the war. And so the summer, like the heat that we experience each summer, as it stretches into late July and into August, it created a malaise over the North and a dispirited sense that this war would never end. And Lincoln knew, and the South knew, that another presidential election was coming in November of 1864. And Lincoln feared, I will not win this election. And he thought, I will do everything I can if I am not reelected to continue to save the Union and transition to the new administration. Frederick Douglass, for his part, watched as the army continued to go after Lee. He watched Lincoln's concerns over the election that was coming. Lincoln himself was concerned that he might not survive the war. And in fact, when we moved finally into 1864 and into 1865, we all, of course, know that Abraham Lincoln is the first president to ever be assassinated. Douglass considered that powerfully in the aftermath of Lincoln's assassination and wept for the man who had given liberty to his people.
In the spring of 1864, I attended a sanitary fair in Baltimore, and some of my comments are as follows. The world has never had a good definition of the word liberty, and the American people just now are much in want of one. We all declare for liberty, but in using the same word, we do not all mean the same thing. With some, the word liberty may mean for each man to do as he pleases with himself and the product of his labor, while with others, the same word may mean for some men to do as they please with other men and the products of other men's labor. Here are two not only different but incompatible things, called by the same name, liberty. And it follows that each of the things is, by the respective parties, called by two different and incompatible names, liberty and tyranny. The shepherd drives the wolf from the sheep's throat, for which the sheep thanks the shepherd for being a liberator, while the wolf denounces the shepherd for the same act as a destroyer of liberty, especially as the sheep is a black woman. The summer of 1864 was not going well as far as the war was concerned. We had such high hopes for General Grant. His aim was to go after General Lee, and he had bottled him up in Petersburg, and so they were settled down for a long siege. There was supposed to be, but there was no movement among the Union forces in the West, and we did not know what General Sherman was up to down south near Georgia. So I summoned Frederick Douglass back to the White House. And when he came and we sat down together, most of my audiences were for about 5 minutes or 10 minutes. And I asked him if he thought the slaves down south knew about the Emancipation Proclamation. He said they didn't. I said we needed to bring up as many people as we could before I lost this election. General McClellan was now no longer a general, but he was the likely Democratic candidate to run for president. And he and the Democratic Party said that the war was a failure and that if he was elected, he would bring about a quick peace and slavery would be left intact. So I told Douglas we needed to bring as many people up from the South before McClellan took office. And I authorized him to deputize any men he wanted to bring about spreading the word down south. However, the next month we heard word that General Sherman captured the city of Atlanta. And so it became clear to most that the war was not a failure. I ran for re-election, and that fall I was elected to a second term. And so it would be the first time in 32 years, not since Andrew Jackson, that a man would serve 2 terms as president. A Connecticut preacher lighted the front door of his church with a quote from the Bible. And the angel of the Lord called unto Abraham out of heaven the second time. I had been wrong about the future of slavery. George Washington and most of the founders were also wrong about slavery. We all felt that slavery would eventually wither and die on the vine. Slavery continues. And now with roughly 4 million slaves, we were now the largest slave-owning country in history, in the land of freedom. So we had done all sorts of things, but slavery was too hard to kill. We had issued confiscation acts, which meant that any escaped slaves or going into the Union forces were free. We had won many military victories, and so the areas of rebellion were now much smaller. I had signed the Emancipation Proclamation, and still, if McClellan took office, the thing that started the war could outlive the war. So the next thing was to support an amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery. Congress had already worked on it, but the House did not reach the 2/3 vote. So in January, Secretary of State Seward would go after those defeated Democrats from New York to see if they could change their votes if it came up a second time, and I would go after the rest of the defeated Democrats. You know, I am a former member of the Whig Party, and the Whigs believe that the executive's main job is to enforce and support all the laws that Congress passed. It was not to be involved at all in the legislative process. But by me being involved in trying to get the amendment passed, I've